Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my channel. My name is DK Dragoon, and I have been a Yu-Gi-Oh player for the last 5 years, and I thought I'd give this a wee try. The deck I am bringing for you today is a deck that me and a few friends of ours personally called the Scumbag Timelords. Now, the Time Lord archetype is a bit different from your stereotypical archetype. They mainly revolve around a bunch of boss monsters at level 10 that revolve around normal summoning themselves, and then on your next standby phase, shuffling them back into the deck. Now, a lot of the decks that you'll see floating around are ones like Time Lord Burn, which revolve around the Burn engine, and things like Just Desserts, Secret Barrel, Secret Blast, and stuff like that. And then the other version you'll see usually online is the one that involves the 3 trap cards, Empty Machine, Infinite Light, and the third one, which name escapes me currently at this point in time. The one I decided to go for was kind of like a mixture of what Magic players would probably say is control to the nth degree, and playing a style of game that you don't really get to see in today's current format. Now, looking at the deck list that you'll probably be seeing now, you're probably seeing something that, in a nutshell, would probably best be described as like an Altergeist or a True Draco sort of thing, revolving around a lot of trap cards, very few monsters, very few spells, and an extra deck that probably, if you were to use Pot of Extravagance, is probably the one that people have just thrown together with what they have. And the sideboard I'll explain in a wee minute, but has a lot of relevance when you're playing in a best of 3 format. Now, the initial lineup is you have obviously your Time Lords. I run 2 of the 4K beater Time Lord. This one's mainly here just because you can't search it out with Time Maiden, and you would rather see it going second to beat over big monsters without having to worry about them negating effects, bouncing the creature back to your hand, etc. You then have Gabriel the Time Lord, which allows you to essentially break the whole entire board of your opponent and allow them to draw cards equal to the number of cards shuffled back into the main deck. The extra deck doesn't count in that, so if you had a full board of extra deck monsters, your opponent would essentially draw nothing off of that. You then have Mike in the Time Lord, which halves your opponent's life. This combined with Card of Demise essentially means that your opponent will go down the 4K life even if you've activated Card of Demise. Zafia in the Time Lord shuffles all your spells and traps. This is great against things like the Altergeist matchup or Sky Strikers, where they revolve heavily on their spell and trap card zone, and this essentially gets rid of it. And if your opponent manages to send it to the graveyard, you get to draw a card off of it, which is also nice. Rafi and the Time Lord is against specifically big monster heavy decks that revolve about high attack and allow you to inflict damage to your opponent equal to the monster's attack that it attacked. Medians, but for bouncing big monster boards. This is in case you don't have Gabriel and allows you to inflict a wee bit of extra damage as well. We then have the spell speed for Time Lord, Camion. Camion is great for dealing with specific threats and also preventing it from being stopped by your opponent. This is essentially the super poly for the archetype, and it's a great one to have and a great one to search out if you need to get rid of Kiwi threats with Time In. And then you have my personal favorite, Lazian, or what essentially I do is summon, pass, draw, dead. This card shuffles the entire graveyard back in the deck. Now, this isn't really relevant against decks that don't focus on Time Lord, but in a meta where Orcust and Sky Striker heavily rely on their graveyard, Lazian is a great way of getting rid of all that support that they've spent turns building up, and then burning them as well whenever they draw a card. You then have 3 Time Maiden. Time Maiden's great as a searcher, but as you'll see with the spell lineup, it doesn't really have much effect. However, there is a wee nice interaction if you draw multiples of them into your open hand, and there might be a replay later on as well that will showcase essentially what's happening there as well. You then have 1 Regeki for wiping boards, 3 Card of Demise for drawing 3 cards, which is especially good for the trap cards. Doesn't help when you draw 3 Time Lords, but as you'll see in the Let's Plays or the playthroughs, it'll not be too much of an issue. In one, I actually drew essentially 2 Time Maidens, which allowed to go to graveyard and allowed me to use their effects on the next turn. 3 Poly Duality for the same reason. And then we get into the trap lineup. Now, a lot of people probably see the essentially 8 Mirror Forces and wonder what the whole strategy of this deck is. The whole strategy of the deck is forcing your opponent to play at a speed that they do not wish to play. Now, in a matchup like, say, True Draco or Altergeist, you'll probably see a lot of slow plays coming, or slow turns coming out of this, because there's so much setting up the spell and trap zone and passing to your opponent. However, with the Storm and Mirror Forces, this allows you to essentially get rid of troublesome cards that can't be destroyed by card effect. You have the bottom trap holes to deal with special summoning of big troublesome creatures that might not wish to attack, or maybe stays in defense position for most of the time. And it also banishes it, which permanently gets rid of it. 2 generic Mirror Forces, just for that destruction, because there's not a lot of creatures currently in the meta that does a lot of protection from destruction. There are ones like Dengetsu and Orcust and stuff like that do that, but for the most part, you only really run 2 of it. You then have Torrential Tribute, which obviously, in combination with the Time Lords don't get destroyed by Torrential Tribute. So essentially, it's essentially 3 extra Regekis in the deck, which is nice. You then run 3 Magic Cylinder. This is just a meme card. They essentially deal damage to your opponent. But if they do, say, for example, use their cards to nick Sindafian and swing into you, you can then use your Magic Cylinder to deal them 4k of damage and essentially reduce their life points by half. Ring of Destruction, just typical burn card. I only run the 1 of it, because as soon as your opponent sees it off a Pot of Duality and add it to your hand, they will more than likely target it, just to make sure they don't get burned themselves. And then we get into the control aspect of the deck. You run 3, there can only be 1. You only really will have ever 1 Time Lord out in the field. So with there can only be 1, you are essentially forcing your opponent to play into the whole solo creature, caveman, Yu-Gi-Oh style form of gameplay. Macrocosmos, this is basically the shut down any deck currently in the format, apart from Thunder Dragon. Sky Striker don't like it, Salamangreat don't like it, Orcust don't like it. The only deck that really does like it would be the Thunder Dragon players. But with that essentially being said, they would prefer seeing their stuff go to the graveyard first before it gets banished, so it does have that wee aspect as well in it, and it is also once per turn, so they can't get the stuff back to the graveyard again. And then 3 Anti-Spell Fragrance. This essentially is to shut down all decks. A lot of decks, this format, rely heavily on the spell lineup, and if you combine Anti-Spell with there can only be 1, decks like Heroes, Sky Striker, Orcust and Salamangreat essentially can't function, and allows you to essentially go into your soul plays. Your extra deck lineup is essentially around a pile of jank. What that means is, when you look at the sideboard, the first 6 cards you'll see here, or first 8 cards, sorry, are more specifically geared towards the Wake and the Dragon. So what I'll do first is I will actually go into the sideboard, and I'll explain the sideboard. You run 6 Hand Traps, 3 Ash Blossom, and your 3 Winter Cherries. That is the deal with the 3 Winter Cherries are there to deal with the extra deck. Mainly if you're going second and your opponent, you know what your opponent's playing, you can essentially Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, possibly some of their best cards, and slow them down tremendously, forcing them to play it at a grinding halt. 3 Week in the Dragon, this is to get some of the other cards out into your extra deck, so Topologic Bomber Dragon, Nightmare Griffin, Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon, and the new card that is currently out only in America, not in Europe, Timelord Progenitor Vulgate. This is a great card, especially with there can only be 1, because what you can do is wipe their board, play there can only be 1, and then on their end phase can only choose 1 of the cards that they banish. This also has some really weird interactions with cards like Weather Painters, because they're essentially only forced to bring back 1 of their cards. But in the meta, it actually completely stalls out on some of the strategies. Then you run 3 Blazing Mirror Forces, just extra Mirror Forces that can deal damage, like Magic Cylinder. And the interesting card that I found out, thanks to a friend of mine, All Out Attacks. What this does is it forces any monster special summoned into attack position, and they have to attack the turn that they are summoned. This essentially means that decks like Orcust and Salamangreat and Thunder Dragon that maybe don't want the attack on the turn that they're all special summoned now have to attack you and force your Time Lords to either activate or force your trap cards to go off, like Magic Cylinder and Storm Mirror Force. So with that being said, it's time to go into the replays. A lot of the decks I were going up against weren't really meta relevant, but I can go step by step into the meta relevancy of it and explain the weaknesses of the deck as well. The first opponent I went up against was running Siranui Zombies. This opening hand sort of showcases what happens if you brick quite badly. You have a lot of spell cards that don't really do anything, and a couple of trap cards that may or may not do anything. My opponent, for whatever reason, decided to target the Time Lords. all the Time Lords have the generic condition of they can't be destroyed by battle artifacts, and you don't take battle damage from them. So targeting the same monster with an effect that destroys was a bit confusing. I think he just didn't read the card's effect, and essentially this allowed me to essentially have the Regeki on board if I needed it, and the Time Maiden to search out whatever I needed. So I went for the Lazian to deal with the graveyard, essentially forcing my opponent to have no graveyard to work with the zombies, and essentially deal the 1000 burn. But in terms of the meta, the one big thing I would say is Sky Striker do also have an advantage if they are going first to deal with this deck. I would highly recommend, if you're going to side anything in, go for things such as Imperial Iron Walls if you're going into a meta that's very heavily reliant on the banishment of creatures or cards. Also decks that revolve around control, so Altergeist, True Draco have a huge, massive effect on how this deck can perform. But as you can see, as the game has been progressing, my opponent has been able to establish a wee bit of a board, but I end up killing him with the Sindafian 2K. Moving on to the next game. The deck that is going to be played is going to be a Shaddoll, using the new support from the structure deck. Personally, I like most of the new support from the Shaddoll structure deck. I don't like the trap card that they announced. And this was actually quite an interesting matchup because my opponent was essentially able to do quite a lot of different wee bits and pieces. And as you can see, the Mycon just essentially reduced his life to half, which is going to force him to probably make a couple of decisions he probably doesn't like. He goes in the Cloth Heap, which is the new Link monster, and is especially good with the fusion because it allows you to special summon cards from the grave. Goes in the Shaddoll Construct and Cloth Heap to do his whole combo and possibly go off into maybe another card. Goes into the Boros Sword, but I ended up using the Stormir Force to bounce his Boros Sword back, essentially wasting a lot of resources that he had, and he sets a monster and passes. The way this deck essentially worked against Shaddolls was my opponent played very aggressively, more aggressively than what I thought he was going to. I thought he was maybe going to stay on one monster and sort of play the resource game, grabbing a lot of resources and then playing out his board. As you can see, I made a misplay there. I used Card of Demise and then had the Rafi in hand, and then sent the Rafi into the grave off the Card of Demise effect, which probably shouldn't have done. But as you can see, looking at a lot of my back row, I have the Mirror Force, the Torrential Tribute, and the Ring of Destruction. This sort of essentially forced him into more of a tight corner. Now he's on 200 life points, and obviously anything that requires paying life points has now been completely shut off unless they're mandatory. And also essentially allows him to play a bit more of a stally sort of game to try and draw out what he needs. I make a misplay and activate Torrential Tribute in the window and forgot to read the destroy card effects, but I did have the Stormir Force to bounce that back to his extra deck, essentially giving me the advantage. But of course, last up in my deck was the graveyard was the Time Maiden, and I essentially just did the pass scoop and win. Moving on to the third game. As you can see, a lot of these decks aren't meta. And as I've said before, Sky Striker, True Draco, Altergeist are probably of the worst matchups against this deck because it does revolve around wasting a lot of resources into doing it, and also Pendulum Magicians, if they get to go first. Establishing a board of maybe 5 or 6 negates will also obviously hurt any deck going into the game, but especially with Timelords, who only really basically summon a creature, set 4 and pass, will hurt it a lot. But as you can see, my opponent really doesn't have much of an answer to deal with the Time Lords. He essentially gives me a Kaiju, which doesn't really bother me too badly. And as you can see as we're playing the game, he doesn't really have a creature that can outbeat the Kaiju that he gave me. I think that was a misplay probably on his part. Probably thought he'd be able to get rid of it using the generator cards. And then I obviously used Kamian to get rid of his field spell, which was the major weakness of the deck. A friend of mine has the whole generator core. I've seen that deck operate. I knew precisely that the field spell is probably its biggest weakness. So obviously I swing in with the Kaiju because a big 33 beater is obviously going to do so much damage to my opponent. And at that stage he just scooped, knowing full rightly that on my next turn the Kaiju was going to kill him. Moving on to the fourth game now. As you can see, the way the deck works, it's very good at restraining your opponent from doing anything big or fancy. However, there is a major weakness in the deck, which is that if it goes blast through all of its resources and doesn't have any steam left, it will just completely flop. And as you can see, the weakness of the deck being that the Time Lords essentially will go back into the deck and you lose resources that way. Going into this game, I didn't know what my opponent was playing. When I saw the Bubble Man, I knew probably he'd be playing some form of hero build, but with there can only be one Macrocosmo and anti-spell, my opponent was essentially forced into not playing fusions for the whole game. And this is where the true power of the deck shines, because essentially it forces your opponent to play a subpar game than what they're probably usually accustomed to, and makes it that essentially I play at the speed that I want and force my opponent to essentially make misplays. So obviously the Sandalphon goes back in the deck. I set my card face down, which is a Mirror Force, and I also have a bottomless trap hole in case he summons a big powerful creature and get rid of it permanently. Now I obviously top deck Pot of Duality, but with the anti-spell I obviously have to set it. But that's actually not that much of a problem in this deck, and what I end up doing is getting rid of the Stratos. Yes, he gets his search off, but in the process, he only has a 1600 beater on the board, which I can easily outlast for a few turns until I top deck a Mirror Force or something better. I obviously see the Pot of Duality again, which is a bit of a weird thing to see so many of the same card appear. But I obviously just normal summon the Time Maiden, search out a Time Lord, and that hopefully will do me for this turn. I obviously see another Mirror Force, which is great in this aspect. And I end up going for the Time Maiden again, knowing that on my next turn I'll probably have to do another search for probably something a bit bigger, something that can maybe do some more damage. And what was interesting was he started to put all of his equips onto the one monster, knowing full rightly that if his monster was ever gone, that would be him. But I end up summoning the Sandalphon, and my opponent surrenders at that point. Going into game 5. This is the final of the solo matches, and then I go in. Oh no, this is actually, yes, sorry. This is the last of the solo games. I play against a Nordic player, who ends up opening quite well, getting a essentially nice big Thor out on the board. But of course I have the bigger monster, and I end up setting a lot of my back row onto the board, with cards like There Can Be Only One, Ring of Destruction, Magic Thunderstorm, and Mirror Force. This is obviously going to hurt my opponent quite a lot, and ends up forcing them to make some misplays. Now, however, I did misplay on that and thought I could target the Odin when it hit the board, but I didn't realize that one of the creatures protected Odin from card effects, such as itself. And that's where I see the 3 Time Maidens all together in the one turn off card demise as well. So essentially I have 3 Time Maidens currently sitting in my graveyard to banish and special summon a Time Lord. I go for Mycon because Mycon can deal the most amount of damage in this turn, having my opponent's life to 2600. And then finally on the next 2 turns, as you will see, he makes a load of misplays, goes into a lot of weird link monsters, not using their abilities, and I end up just using this to my advantage to deal as much damage as humanly possible in the next 2 turns and end up winning. Now, in the end, the way this deck works, it's great for beginner players. If you're not playing with an extra deck, the deck will cost altogether £60 for the main deck, and then whatever you want for the extra deck. And then the side deck, if you want to splash out for it and get all these extra cards, the Waken the Dragons, the Blazings, the all-out hacks and stuff like that, you're probably looking at maybe £20 to £30 or whatever that is in dollars. Overall, it's a great budget option for players. I highly recommend picking it up. New players will probably find this deck easy to pick up and play. It's probably on the nice low spectrum for initially getting started, but it does have a high ceiling curve, knowing exactly when they activate the trap cards, when not they activate the trap cards, knowing how the spells work, knowing when you can and can't special summon, and remembering cards like Anti-Spell Fragrance and There Can Be Only One on the board. But guys, that's my deck profile and a few replays there for you. I hope you've had fun, and I hope to bring more content for you in the future. Apart from that though, enjoy the rest of your days, guys, and I hope to see you again soon.